Is this pointing in the right way? I filmed the whole video with the microphone pointing at the camera the other day, so I'm a bit concerned that it's going to do that again. Still getting used to them. Hello! It is that time of year, the beginning of the year, where I talk about the best books that I read last year. So these are my top 10 favourite books I read in 2024. I know lots of people put this video out at the end of December. How can you do that when you haven't finished reading for the year? You don't know yet that these are definitely your best ones. I, on the other hand, will wait until January when nobody is interested in watching these videos anymore. I don't rate books when I'm talking about them on this channel out of 5 stars, but I do on Storygraph to give myself a sort of overall idea about how my reading year is going. And how it went last year is that I didn't give a single book 5 stars. So whilst these are my 10 favourite books of the year, unfortunately, I don't know if any of them are new favourite books ever. There are 2, at least 3. There are 5. There are 5 that I want to reread, which are my top 5 on this list. And maybe on a reread they would become brand new favourites. But I basically have 4 stars and 5 4.5 stars on this list. So we're going to start at the bottom and work our way up. The list could often rearrange, even number 1. So, but I'm going to dive in. First one, number 10, is Hangman by Binyam. I read this back in the summer when I was reading the Women's Prize for Fiction a selection of the Women's Prize for Fiction long list, which I will leave linked in the cards above. This is set in an unnamed francophone African nation, and it is about a man who had emigrated to the US and was working there as a taxi driver, and he ends up coming back to his home country and is picked up by his brother, and he's moving around the country, and it is a very strange, disconnected, surreal book written in this very sort of matter-of-fact style, and he is constantly hearing the story of something that has happened back in America, where a man from the same country he is from has gotten into trouble for kidnapping a woman in a taxi. We are hearing what happened in that story, and also his experience of returning home. There are a lot of these nostoi that are very common, especially among immigrant narratives, the idea of returning home to the place that you came from and it not being the same as it once was. But I really enjoyed the way this one was told. It is strange and dreamlike in a lot of ways, never quite going where you are expecting. If you are a character-driven reader who needs to really get into all of the different characters in a story, I don't think this one would be for you, because there is so much that feels strange and almost fable-like to the way that the characters are. It feels like a really old story in a way, but it deals with a lot of themes around immigration and the treatment of immigrants in Western nations, the dependence on them for their labour, and then the abuse of them regardless of that. And then also it talks about, as I said, familial relationships, bond between brothers, and it is a strange little book, a unique little book, and I'm really, really glad that I read it. Then we have Fervour by Lloyd. This is a proof that I was gifted by Scepter, but the real cover does look quite a lot like this. This is set over 2 time periods about this Jewish family in London. 2 parents, a grandfather and 3 children living in this big house in North London, and the mother is trying to get the grandfather to tell him his experience of the Holocaust, and he is very unwell and on his last legs and not really wanting to talk about it. And then the daughter goes missing, and then we flash forward to the time where the youngest son is at university, and he is getting outside of his family for the first time. His family are a very strange family. They are very religious in a very kind of idiosyncratic way, in that they believe in a literal interpretation of the Old Testament and in the actual presence of good and evil and demons. And so the daughter, when she disappears, she does return, but her mother begins to suspect she's been involved in Jewish witchcraft. Their mother, when we flash forward into the university experience, her mother is a very well-known right-wing Jewish intellectual, really strongly Zionist, and it really affects the son's experience of university. He experiences anti-Semitism, and it does explore, he gets into a friendship with this other woman from whom we see the perspective of, who is ethnically Jewish but raised completely outside of the Jewish faith. Her experience of her own Jewishness, her obsession with this family, and this family's obsession with mystic Judaism is a really interesting story, and there is this huge amount of tension throughout. These are very, very unlikable characters. who are like in really complicated and twisted relationships in a lot of ways. The way they relate to one another delves into so much about like what is anti-Semitism, and about liberal versus orthodox Jewish belief, and about relationships, familial relationships, controlling mothers. It's a really, really great little book, and I really, really enjoyed it, and I think it's one that not a lot of people have read. I don't think I've heard a lot of other people talking about this book, so if any of that sounds interesting to you, I love a book with religion in it, particularly the darker, kind of more esoteric examples of that. Another book that I read when I was reading a selection of the Women's Prize for Fiction long list was The Wren by Anne Enright. Anne Enright is an Irish author that I've heard of, but I had never read before. And this is about 3 generations in a family. Apparently culturally specific explorations of family have been some things that I have really enjoyed this year. So in this book we have a daughter who is a Gen Z millennial kind of person, off at university, getting involved with men sexually in a way that is not enjoyable for her. And then we have the mother who raised this daughter on her own, and we flash back to when the daughter was young and her mother was raising her. Her relationships with other people, her relationships with her sister and her mother, and so this mother's father, whose perspective we also do see later, was a very well-known Irish writer and poet, but he was also abusive to her mother, and also abandoned the family. And so there are elements of this idea of male genius, and who is harmed by kind of mid-century idea of male geniuses being allowed to sort of do whatever because it is important for their craft, and the way that this man is valorized as part of the Irish nation mythology building for being a voice of the nation. His personal life and the way he treated the people he really knew, the difference between those things. We do also see his writing, his translations of, this is what I mean by Irish mythology nation building, he translates Irish language poetry from like the 18th century into English. It's so interesting because you hear him from her perspective, and then you see this kind of charming, intelligent guy, but you can almost be drawn in by this male genius. At the same time, his harm and the things that he's perpetuated, you already know them, they're already in the back of your head. And so we have these 3 generations and the way they interact with one another. The daughter becoming interested in her grandfather's poetry while she is studying literature at university. Interest in, obsession with the relationship that she has never had with a grandfather. Just a really simple, still story, a very much character-based story that is really great at voice in particular. Mother, who I believe is called Carmel. She is one of the best characters that I have read this year. I really enjoyed her voice. She felt so realistic to me. She reminded me so much of my mum, my aunts, like these Irish women that I know. Would you get over yourself, kind of. But at the same time, there is a tenderness, like a strong love that is not displayed with softness, but with force. The younger character I did feel was a little weaker because she didn't feel quite as well honed. A lot of the views on media felt like they were coming from someone who isn't a huge user of social media, but I find that a lot when I'm reading literature, and the voices of the characters were so strong and so beautiful. The grandfather's writings, absolutely stunning. Now another one for character readers is Only Here, Only Now by Tom Newlands. And if you are looking for young male writers, which I know seem to be always talked about as being missing, then Tom Newlands is someone you could look for. So this is set in Scotland in the 80s and 90s about a young girl. She is described as hyperactive, and she lives in council housing in Fife, and her mother is disabled. It is about her growing up with this sort of misunderstood mental health condition or experience of the world, and also growing up in poverty, and it really focuses in on the working class experience of growing up in Scotland in the 90s. And her mother gets into a relationship with this man, and the relationship between her daughter and this man, it's not bad, it's not sexual, but we go from her about the age of 12 through up into her 20s, and the pitfalls she keeps falling into because of her lack of impulse control, because of her like not being able to follow things through, her difficulties in relationships with other people her age who often think of her as very strange, and because of the combination of her what we would now call ADHD and her poverty. It is just a really great portrait of this person who is resilient and difficult, not always likeable, always getting into different scrapes, and the ways that poverty has such an effect on your life and your life choices and chances. Her relationships, as I said, with her stepfather and with her the other girls, and as she grows up with other people in her town. And I just think it was a really great and really refreshing read. It was not easy to read because she is such an anxious person. There is such an anxiety pervading through the writing of this, and I found it very difficult at times. Experience of reading really got you into the character's mind. It was also this book that made me want to read more books by working class authors, because reading that experience felt so like something I have not read a lot of. It was darkly funny and kind of bizarre in a very like dry British comedy way. Then we have Mongrel by Hanako Footman, which is again familial relationships in a culturally specific setting. This is about 3 women. One woman who is from Japan, and she moves to England to study music. When she gets to England, she starts up a relationship with her white English music teacher, who is a fair amount older than her. And then we also have this other young woman who is also a musician, growing up in the UK, and she is half Japanese, half English, and she lost her mother very, very young, and so she is growing up in a very white area and feels very disconnected from the Japanese part of her, and feels very isolated because her father married a new woman. And then the third person is this young Japanese woman in a rural area in Japan who lives with her grandparents. She lost her mother when she was quite young, and she doesn't know who her father is. She's moved to Tokyo and become a sex worker. These 3 different people, their lives intersect in certain ways, but also the themes of cultural identity, mothers and mothering, and the way that mothers link to culture. So sexual violence and music are all very important parts of this story, and it made me cry. Really painful look at adolescence and young adulthood and the vulnerability there. The sharpness of the relationships that are being written about made it so heart-wrenching, but also very, very beautiful. All of these characters feel very isolated and have difficulties with desire and love. There is also a queer aspect to it. One of our characters is in love with her best friend, and it is a very kind of that teenage girl obsessive relationship. It was just such a pure distillation of adolescence and early adulthood, and of isolation and those emotions, and grief as well. Grief has definitely been one of the themes of the books that I've read this year, and Mongrel was one of the earliest books that I read on that theme, but a really beautiful one, and another one that I think fewer people have read. Next we have one of the books that I read for the Big Book Club this year, and that is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. These are the ones that I think on a reread I would really enjoy. So this is set in the early 19th century, and it is about magicians in England. It is fantasy, so it feels like it should be really out of my comfort zone. I don't think fantasy ever really ends up on my top 10 list of the year. However, this is historical fiction, definitely does, and this is also written like a classic, like a Victorian classic writing a Napoleonic era book, like Vanity Fair or Wuthering Heights. So it is 1,000 pages long, so just a warning. But as I said, it's about magicians, and so England had magic in it, but the Raven King left and magic left England. In the early 1800s, Mr. Norrell is deciding to bring practical magic back to England. Very into book-learnt magic, and doesn't want to be involved with fairies who brought magic to England before. But in order to get attention, he brings a woman back to life, and he makes a pact with a fairy in doing this, and that kind of sets everything off. Jonathan Strange is another practical music magician who comes about at the same time, and he is much more sort of instinctive and interested in the Raven King and fairies, and he becomes Mr. Norrell's assistant, learning from him, but there is also a schism, and they get involved in fighting the Napoleonic Wars, and as the book goes more and more along, it becomes more and more fantastical, and I really, really enjoyed it. Footnotes, and the footnotes tell you the history of fairy, and I would really like to read this book without reading the footnotes and see how the experience differs. I really enjoyed the atmosphere of this. I really thought that, as I said, it is written really similarly to Victorian novels about this time period, and there is a narrator who has a conscious voice, and I think that Susanna Clarke has done such a great job that style of writing whilst also making it feel modern. It talked about gender and race and class in this time period in a very kind of tongue-in-cheek, understated way. There is such absurdity and humour, and it's definitely mocking a lot of these characters, both Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, but a lot of the people around them. It's almost Dickensian in that, but a little sharper, Austonian in that sense. And so it is almost a satire of British literature at the same time as being a fantasy novel about magic. And I think it's stunning in terms of the writing, in terms of the tone, and in terms of the things covered, but I do think I would need to read it again. I think then this may actually become one of my favourites. The only non-fiction on this list, I didn't read a huge amount of non-fiction last year, definitely something I want to rectify this year, but we have The Old Ways by Robert McFarlane. Robert McFarlane is one of the best writers I have read. Fiction, non-fiction, whatever you say. His writing is just stunning. He has such a beautiful way of describing nature. He's mostly a nature/travel writer, and his writing in that style is so immersive and evocative. It makes it feel almost fantastical. There is an element of the folk tale about it, and I really, really love that style. But it is also like simple and plain and straightforward. Like, it's not convoluted. It is like the best poetry, and I really, really enjoyed that. So this is his story of walking the old ways, or the sort of footpaths, the ancient footpaths around Britain, the ancient seaways, and then he also does a bit of the Camino in Spain and walks through Palestine with a Palestinian friend of his as well. He weaves in elements of history and folk tales, and just the stunning atmosphere, I think, is the thing that really sticks with me. It is also, he is a writer that really sparks me, makes me feel creative, gives me ideas, and makes me want to write, and I think that that is something that I really enjoy in him. I think if you are a writer who is interested in history and folk tales, mysticism in a way, I think you would really enjoy this, and it would really like spark interest for you too, because a lot of this is about storytelling and the oral storytelling tradition, and the ways that oral storytelling links to nature, and I think it's just really, really stunning, and I would definitely recommend it. There is a moment in this where he stays on a mount in a circle of trees and things, and there is a ghost story about it, or the moment where he walks one of the most dangerous walks in Britain because of the tide, and just the stunningness of the atmosphere. I love the way that he marries the simplicity of what he is doing with the sublime, and I just think stunning, stunning writing. Another Irish writer on this list, definitely a theme of my year, again, is Long Island by Colm Toibin. I think Colm Toibin I need to read more of, because I think he could become one of my favourite writers. Long Island is the story of Ailish, whose first book he wrote about her was Brooklyn. I have not read Brooklyn, definitely need to now, but I enjoyed this book anyway. So Ailish in this book, she is a woman living in Long Island, married to an Italian American, surrounded by his family, and she is 3,000 miles away from her family and her culture. And she feels kind of suffocated by this family and being the only non-Italian American in the family, and the expectations put on her by the matriarch. And she, at the very beginning of this novel, finds something out in a very distressing way about her relationship, throws her into confusion about why she is living this life feeling this stifled way if it is not what she thought it was. And so she travels back to Ireland. Her past kind of comes back to her relationships with people in the village, and the experience of living in a small town where everyone watches everyone, the propriety expected of you and the behaviours expected. And it is told in different perspectives. There is also a woman who is a widow dealing with two children who are adult children. Because she's become a widow, she has had to open a chip shop, and it is really frowned upon in 1970s in this small town. And there is also this man who is the landlord of a pub, who was someone Ailish had a relationship with in the past, and he is a very slow, stolid man. He is such an interesting character, a very quiet, understated man who does not talk very much and has all these hopes and dreams, but feels like there isn't space for dreams and space for freedom of expression here. There is a very rigid control. Colm Toibin, the way that he writes is very simple, but there is a lot that goes on underneath. There is a lot of inferring that you have to do things, and they don't explain what they're feeling, and I love that. That's what I want from a book. It is very much the brush of a hand kind of book rather than a like serious, earnest confessions kind of a book, and definitely that is my preference. Number 2, we are nearly at the end here. Number 2 on my list is My Friends by Hisham Matar, which won the Orwell Prize, and I read when I was reading the Booker Prize long list, which I will leave linked to the cards above. This is about a Libyan man who has come to study in Edinburgh, and he is gets involved with the politics in Edinburgh and ends up at a protest at the Libyan embassy. And because of the outcome of that, he cannot return back to Libya. He cannot see his friends and family. And it is about his relationships with his friends, hence the title, but also with his family and with Libya and being Libyan and what that means as an exile. It is about having grown up under a controlling regime and his experience of his love of Libyan culture and the suffocation of such a regime. Storytelling and construction of a person and what it means to create a person, an identity, and how that is linked to your growing up, and also how it is linked to your culture. That changes when you are in exile from it. It is about grief and loss and suffering. It is about how it is impossible to ever truly know another person. It is another book like the Colm Toibin where people don't say what they are thinking or feeling. Everything is very distanced and closed off. This man, he is very understated and underplayed and rigid and controlled in a way, and doesn't express himself or open up, and we are from his perspective, and so there is a sense of claustrophobia, which I think is reflecting that growing up in a controlling country, but also this disconnect from the world, this impossibility of truly knowing another person. This book is so wonderfully told in this understated warmth. The tone of this book is so warm, but it takes a while for you to notice that that is what it's doing. One of the characters in this is a writer, and he tells this story of a man slowly being eaten by a cat until the point where only his head is left, and then he says no. You kind of are left to interpret that book in the context of what is going on, and the way that it sort of alludes to the political situation in Libya at the time, and everything is indirect, and I think that that is a reflection of a country where you are not allowed to express yourself, and I love the indirectness of this. I think warm, beautiful, so sad and tender and loving, and disconnected at the same time. I love the way that he was able to bring those things together. It actually has a quote from Colm Toibin on the front, so I think these two writers are definitely ones that if you liked one, you would enjoy the other. And then finally, we have Sally Rooney's Intermezzo. Now, I don't know if I would always put this above Hisham Matar. I don't know if it would always win, but it is definitely a novel that I really, really enjoyed. Having ruminated on it, I think it might be my favourite Sally Rooney. So this is about Peter and Ivan, two young brothers who have lost their father. Peter is in his early 30s, Ivan in his early 20s. And it is another book about grief, the theme of my year. The portions told from Ivan's perspective are told in the prose you've come to expect from Sally Rooney, a kind of lyrical simplicity, a very emotional and also theoretical in terms of its discussions of class and characters who just think a lot, overthinkers, I think. Ivan is a chess player who had been a young prodigy but has not made it to Grandmaster and is feeling disconnected from his chess. But he goes to do a chess tournament, and there he meets a woman whose name is either Margaret or Marianne. And Margaret, it is Margaret. And she is much older than him. She is in her early 30s and is separated from her husband and lives in this small town. And so she feels a lot of shame and discomfort about this relationship with Ivan, concerned about propriety and doing the right thing. And we kind of explore her relationships with her mother and with her ex-husband and with this small town and with Catholicism, how that all leads to her, to these feelings for her. And then the section from Peter's perspective is told in a very different way. It is an homage to James Joyce. It is very stilted and staccato, and it reflects the way that Peter is coming apart at the seams because of his grief. He was in a relationship with a woman who he met at university, and he still loves her, but she broke up with him after a car accident left her incapable of physical intimacy, and how she thought that that would affect on their relationship. There is a lot of suppositions and ideas of what should be, I think, are big parts of this, big themes of this novel, the idea of the should versus the practical reality of life. And he is also in a relationship with a woman in her early 20s who is squatting in a house and does OnlyFans to make money. how capitalism affects relationships and power dynamics, and the independence and self-reliance versus interdependence and relationality. And I think that those are all really well expressed. I enjoyed both types of writing, and I got really into the Peter chapters. They took a while for me to get my head around the different form, but I did enjoy them, and I thought that they worked well to tell the story of this difficult man in a difficult time period. I did a whole video about class in Sally Rooney, and it talks about the cultural aspects of it, and I think that this is, all Sally Rooney's novels are Irish novels because Sally Rooney is Irish, but I do think that Catholicism and Irish politics are big parts of this book, and I just think it was really beautiful, and I really enjoyed it. So those are my top 10 novels that I read, not novels, those are my top 10 books that I read last year. As I said, it wasn't my best reading year, so I'd love some recommendations from you based on these 10 in the comments down below if you have any. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you are new here, my name is Roisin. I put out new videos once a week, so I will see you again very soon, probably on a Sunday. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.